I haven't told this story to my family or anyone close to me. I used to work at one hospital close to our town, and I have worked night shift as a nurse for almost 7 years before this happened. Night shifts in hospitals have a strange atmosphere that most people never experience. During the day, hospitals feel busy, noisy, and almost normal, with phones ringing, doctors rushing through hallways, families visiting patients. But at night, everything changes. The lights dim slightly in the corridors. The waiting rooms are mostly empty. The sounds become softer, stranger, monitors beeping, ventilation humming through a long, quiet hallways. It feels like the hospital becomes a completely different place, almost like it belongs to something else. Back in 2018, I was working in a small regional hospital just outside Denver. It wasn't a huge facility, only 4 floors and maybe 90 beds total, but we handled everything from emergency cases to long-term patients. I usually worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift on the 3rd floor. That floor handled post-surgery recovery and long-term patients who needed constant monitoring, and that was where room 417 was. At first, it was just another room to me, until the night I realized someone was calling for help from inside. It was around 2:30 a.m., which nurses often call the quiet hour. Most patients are asleep, doctors are gone. I was sitting at the nurse's station finishing chart notes when I heard something strange through the hallway. A voice, very faint. At first I thought it was just a patient calling for assistance, but then I heard it again. A weak whisper. Hello? It sounded like it was coming from the end of the hall. I stood up and walked down the corridor. The hallway lights were dimmed to night mode, casting long shadows across the floor. My footsteps echoed softly as I approached the door. The voice came again. Please help me. I knocked lightly. Hello, nurses here. No response, but I could have sworn I heard something shift inside, so I pushed the door open. The room was completely empty. The bed was neatly made, no patient monitors were active. The lights were off except for the dim hallway glow spilling through the doorway. Room 417 hadn't had a patient in 2 days. I checked the bathroom. Empty. For a moment I just stood there feeling confused. Maybe I'd heard someone from another room. Hospitals are weird like that. Sound travels through vents and walls in strange ways. So I shrugged it off and returned to the nurse's station. But about 10 minutes later, I heard the voice again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. The call button alarm went off. Every patient room has one. When a patient presses the red button next to their bed, it alerts the nurse's station. The board lit up. Room 417, assistance requested. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I looked down the hallway. The door to room 417 was still closed. My coworker Lisa glanced at the board too. Didn't you say that room was empty? She asked. Yeah, I said slowly. Well, someone pressed the button. We both walked down the hallway together. Something about it made the air feel heavier. I opened the door again, still empty, but this time something was different. The call button cord was hanging off the side of the bed, swinging slightly, like it had just been dropped. Maybe housekeeping bumped it earlier. Maybe. My coworker Lisa reset the system and we went back to work. But about 20 minutes later, the board lit up again. Room 417, assistance requested. Lisa looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us laughed. Around 4 a.m., a senior nurse named Marjorie arrived early for her shift. She had been working at that hospital for nearly 30 years. Lisa casually mentioned what happened. Marjorie froze. Then she asked quietly, Room 417? I nodded. She stared down the hallway for a long moment before speaking. That room used to be occupied by a man named Daniel. He died in there, about a week ago. That wasn't unusual, hospitals see death all the time. But Marjorie continued. He kept pressing the call button every night. For what? I asked. He said someone was standing in the corner of his room. Lisa laughed nervously. Probably hallucinations, she said. That's what we thought, Marjorie said. But every night he said the same thing. What thing? She looked at both of us. He said the man in the corner was waiting for the bed. Neither of us spoke. Then Marjorie added quietly, Daniel died at 2:31 a.m. That was when the real fear got into me. 2:31 a.m. was almost the exact time I heard the first whisper. Around 5:15 a.m. I was doing rounds when I passed room 417 again. The door was cracked open slightly. I was sure we had closed it earlier. The hallway behind me was silent. I pushed the door open. The room looked exactly the same, empty. But as I stepped inside, I heard breathing, right next to the bed. I turned slowly. The mattress had a slight indentation in it, like someone was sitting there. My heart started pounding. "Hello?" I said. The indentation deepened slightly, and then the call button cord slowly lifted off the floor, as if invisible fingers had grabbed it. I ran out of that room. When the day shift arrived, I told the charge nurse everything. She didn't laugh. Instead, she quietly filled out a maintenance request. Room 417 was sealed for electrical inspection, but the room stayed closed for almost 3 months. Eventually, it reopened. New patients stayed there. Nothing else happened, at least not officially. But one night about a year later, I ran into Lisa again in the hallway. She looked so scary. "Do you still remember room 417? She asked. "Yeah," I said. She leaned closer and said, "Last night a patient pressed the call button. He said someone was sitting on his bed." "What did they look like?" I asked. "He said the man looked sick, like a patient." My whole body went cold. "What did the man say?" I asked. Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said," she glanced toward the room, "he was still waiting." "And the strangest part?" I asked again. "Room 417 still exists," she replied. "And nurses working night shift there say that sometimes, around 2:30 a.m., the call light flickers on, even when the room is empty." I left that place the next morning because whatever that was in room 417 was not only angry, he was ready for revenge. When people imagine hospitals at night, they usually picture quiet hallways and sleeping patients. What they don't realize is that hospitals never truly sleep. Machines keep running. Patients wake up confused. People cry. People die. And sometimes, strange things happen that no one can explain. I learned that during my second year working as a night nurse. The hospital I worked in back then was much older than the one I work in now. It sat on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania, surrounded by thick woods and empty parking lots. The building had originally been constructed in the early 1950s. Back then it had been used partly as a tuberculosis treatment center before being converted into a full hospital decades later. A lot of staff joked that the building felt haunted, but like most nurses, I didn't believe in that kind of thing. At least not until the night I saw someone walking through a hospital floor that had been completely locked down. And the worst part, the person I saw couldn't have been alive. The 4th floor of that hospital was rarely used. Years earlier it had been the psychiatric ward. But after renovations and new mental health facilities opened elsewhere, the hospital closed that section down. Most of the rooms were empty, some were used for storage. But after 10 p.m. the entire floor was locked. Security policy required it. No patients, no visitors, no staff unless maintenance or supervisors specifically authorized access. On most nights, no one even went up there. But on one particular shift in October 2019, I had to. It was around 1:30 a.m. when the charge nurse asked me to grab a box of extra IV supplies stored in a closet on the 4th floor. Normally, housekeeping would do it, but the supply room downstairs had run out. I ran straight back to the nurse's station. The charge nurse saw my face immediately. "What happened?" she asked. I told her everything. At first, she thought I was joking. But when she saw how shaken I was, she called security. 2 guards went upstairs to check the floor. They found nothing. All doors were still locked. No patients, no staff, no sign anyone had been there. But they did review the security camera footage. And what they found made the entire night shift uncomfortable. At 1:42 a.m., the camera at the end of the 4th floor hallway recorded something strange, and for a brief moment, the shape appeared near the wall. Then it disappeared. Later that week, one of the older nurses told me something I hadn't known. Back when the 4th floor was still a psychiatric ward, There had been a patient who stayed there for years, a man named Thomas Calder. According to hospital records, he suffered from severe confusion and memory loss. He often wandered the halls at night. Staff constantly had to guide him back to his room. One night in 1974, Thomas disappeared from the ward. Security searched the entire hospital, but they didn't find him until morning. He had collapsed at the end of the fourth-floor hallway. He died before anyone reached him, and according to the nurses who worked there back then, for years afterward, staff sometimes reported seeing a man in a hospital gown wandering the halls at night. I tried to forget the whole experience. Hospitals are stressful places, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. But about 3 months later, something happened again. I was leaving the building after a night shift. It was almost 7 a.m. The sky outside was just starting to brighten. As I walked across the parking lot, I glanced up at the hospital windows, and I saw something moving behind the glass on the 4th floor, walking slowly down the hallway, back and forth, like someone wandering without direction. The problem was, that entire floor had been locked since the night I saw it, and no one had gone up there since. Even now, years later, I still work as a nurse. I still do night shifts. But whenever I pass through older parts of hospitals late at night, I always check the hallways carefully, because sometimes the people you see walking there aren't actually patients anymore. I used to believe that every strange thing in a hospital had a logical explanation. Machines malfunction, patients hallucinate, staff get tired and start imagining things after too many night shifts. That's what I told myself for years, until the night I answered a call from a patient who had already been dead for nearly 2 hours. I remember that night clearly because it was the quietest shift I'd had in months. It was late November of 2021, and I was working as a registered nurse in a mid-sized hospital in Ohio. The building was old, built sometime in the late 1960s, and parts of it still felt like they hadn't been updated since then. Long, narrow hallways, yellowish fluorescent lighting, rooms with heavy doors that creaked when they opened. I was assigned to the medical surgical floor, which mostly handled elderly patients recovering from surgeries or illnesses. That night, my main responsibility was watching over a man in bed 12. His name was Mr. Harold Whitaker. He was 84 years old and had been admitted 3 days earlier with severe pneumonia. By the time my shift started, his condition had already worsened significantly. His oxygen levels kept dropping, and the doctors had already informed his family that he probably wouldn't survive the night. I had seen situations like that many times before. End-of-life care is a sad but normal part of working in healthcare. Around 11:45 p.m., Mr. Whitaker's daughter and grandson visited him one last time. They stood quietly beside the bed, holding his hand. His daughter cried softly. The grandson just stared at the floor. After about 20 minutes, they said goodbye and left. Mr. Whitaker passed away shortly after midnight. I was there when it happened. At 12:18 a.m., the heart monitor produced that long, flat tone that every nurse recognizes instantly. I checked his pulse. Nothing. I checked his breathing. Nothing. The doctor arrived a few minutes later and officially pronounced the time of death, 12:23 a.m. We turned off the monitors and dimmed the room lights. Then we covered his body with a sheet. The hospital transport team was scheduled to move him to the morgue later that night. Until then, the room would remain closed. I remember walking out of the room and pulling the door shut behind me. About an hour later, I was sitting at the nurse's station finishing paperwork. The hallway lights were dimmed. Most of the patients were asleep. Everything felt calm. That's when the call light panel on the wall suddenly beeped. I glanced up automatically. Every patient room has a button near the bed that alerts the nurses when someone needs help. Usually it means someone needs medication, water, or assistance getting to the bathroom. But when I looked at the panel, I felt my stomach drop. The light blinking was for room 212, bed 12, Mr. Whitaker's room. I stared at it for a few seconds. Maybe someone had gone into the room and accidentally pressed the button. Or maybe it was a system glitch. Still, protocol required me to check. So I stood up and walked down the hallway. The door to room 212 was closed just like I had left it. I opened it slowly. The room was dark except for a faint glow from the hallway. Mr. Whitaker's body was still lying in the bed under the sheet. Completely still. The call button cord rested beside the mattress. I walked over and picked it up. No one had pressed it. The button wasn't even lit. I reset the system at the wall panel and left the room. At that point, I assumed it had just been a technical issue. Hospitals run on complicated electronic systems, and glitches happen sometimes. But about 10 minutes later, the panel beeped again. Same room. Bed 12. Something didn't feel right. This time I felt uneasy before I even reached the door. The hallway seemed darker than before. When I opened the door again, the room looked exactly the same, except for one thing. The call button cord was lying on the floor. I was absolutely sure it had been on the bed earlier. I picked it up again and placed it beside the mattress. Then I checked Mr. Whitaker's body just to be certain nothing had shifted. Everything was exactly as it should be. I left the room again, but when I reached the nurse's station, my coworker Amanda looked up at me. "Did you just go into 212?" she asked. "Yeah," she frowned. "That's weird." "Why?" Amanda pointed to the call panel. "It's been going off the whole time you were in there." I turned around. Sure enough, the indicator light for bed 12 was still blinking. But I had just reset it inside the room. A strange chill ran down my spine. Around 2:40 a.m., something even stranger happened. The phone at the nurse's station rang. Hospitals have internal phone lines connected to patient rooms. Sometimes patients call instead of using the button. I answered automatically. "Medical floor, this is Rachel." For a moment there was only static. Then I heard something, breathing, followed by a voice. "Hello?" It was barely above a whisper, but it sounded exactly like Mr. Whitaker. My chest tightened. "Who is this?" I asked. The voice spoke again. I felt my hands start to shake. "Sir, what room are you in?" There was a long pause, then the voice said something that made my blood run cold. "Bed 12. The phone line went dead. Amanda saw the look on my face immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I think the call came from 212. She laughed nervously. "That's impossible." But we both walked down the hallway anyway. The door to room 212 was wide open. Neither of us had left it that way. The air inside the room felt cold, much colder than the rest of the floor. The sheet covering Mr. Whitaker's body had shifted slightly, like something underneath it had moved. Amanda whispered, "Did you touch the body earlier?" "No." Then we both noticed something else. The call button was in Mr. Whitaker's hand. His fingers were curled tightly around it. Neither of us had placed it there. And the light on the button was glowing red. The hospital reviewed the security footage the next day. The cameras in the hallway outside room 212 had been recording the entire night, and what they found made everyone uncomfortable. At 2:39 a.m., the door to room 212 slowly opened by itself. No one was in the hallway. No staff, no patients, no movement anywhere. But the door clearly swung open, and at 2:40 a.m., the nurse's station phone rang. Exactly when I answered the call. The strangest part came later that week. While reviewing Mr. Whitaker's medical history, Amanda noticed something odd. Before he died, he had been pressing the call button repeatedly, every few minutes. When the nurses asked him why, he kept giving the same answer. He said someone in the room kept whispering to him. When they asked what the person wanted, Mr. Whitaker told them something that still bothers me. He said the voice kept saying, "Press the button, someone needs to answer." I stopped working at that hospital because I still believe most things have rational explanations. But every once in a while, when a call light goes off in an empty room, I remember the voice on that phone.